So I will start by introducing our next speaker. Eva Dyer is a neuroscientist and a data scientist at Georgia Tech, Emory University. And I think something that I find really interesting and special about Eva's work is that when you think about data science, you think of that as being maybe in the intersection between fields, maybe here in this case, machine learning and neuroscience. And it's often very hard to do cutting edge work that's both cutting, at the cutting edge of machine learning and at the cutting edge of neuroscience. And I think it was quite unique in the fact that whenever I hear her talk, I see that it's really kind of pushing the boundaries on both of them at the same time. And so today she'll talk about self-supervised learning. And take it away.
Cool. Thanks so much for the invitation. And, I've attended the NeuroHackademy in the past when it's in person. So it's a shame that we don't all get to, join together in person, but excited to, still share this time with you all. So what I'll talk about today is some recent work that we've been doing. As Aria was saying, we work at the interface of machine learning, data science, and neuroscience. And in general, we're interested in ways in which we can take information from the brain, whether it be from individual neurons or maybe even through fMRI or other signals, measuring, information and signals within the brain, and be able to take those and boil them down into some sort of simplified or potentially interpretable representation of what's going on within the brain. And if we can do a good job of forming those representations in a way that's stable and sort of reliable, then we can also potentially be able to decode information from the brain, which can help in, brain-machine interfaces, prosthetics, and also have a lens into how the brain is changing over the course of disease or aging or neurodegeneration, which is an application that we're particularly interested in. So what I'll talk about today, hopefully, okay, let's see. Okay, is ways in which we are trying to, think about new frameworks for forming these representations in an unsupervised way. So meaning where we don't necessarily have labels that are driving our underlying picture of what the activity looks like, right? So before I jump into the actual project and the work that I'll discuss today in self-supervised representation learning, which I'll go into the details of, I'll just quickly talk about the team that made all of this happen and introduce the folks both from our lab. So over here on the left, the two projects I'll talk about today were mainly driven by Midi and also Ron in my lab. And this is an ongoing collaboration with folks at WashU in St. Louis, Keith Hangen and his team, and then also researchers at DeepMind, including Mohammed Azar and Michelle Valco, and kind of bringing all of these, with these very large projects, we need a lot of different minds and a lot of different expertise and insights to really bring these large projects together. So these are the folks that have made this work possible. So as I sort of alluded to at the beginning, when looking at pictures of what the brain is doing, oftentimes we can, we have access to labels or information about behavior that we might want to relate to the brain. So traditional approaches for supervised decoding have often, take those behavioral labels and try to find a mapping between brain activity and, the outputs of the brain. So if we're talking about movement, predicting a reach or where in space we intend to make a movement towards, or if it's in visual representations, what are we actually looking at, right? Like what are the inputs coming in. So if we have a label to associate with data and we can form a supervised mapping between the two, that gives us a way of reading out information. But obviously we know that there's probably a lot of other stuff that's really going on under the hood, right? And so being able to form a representation of activity without having specific labels to guide us could be a very powerful way of getting a lens into what's really going on in the brain. So that sort of motivates this idea of unsupervised learning as a way forward in understanding what populations of neurons are doing potentially. And sorry, I should have had a few more intro slides here, I'm realizing. But so in unsupervised learning, often what we try to do is we try to take collections of data and essentially form some sort of generative model or a way of reconstructing or recapitulating images or samples that we've sort of we've learned from through whatever machine learning architecture system that we apply. You know, on one hand, this is a good strategy because it gives us, if we kind of constrain the dimensionality of our representation through this reconstruction process, it can give us a way of finding the kind of core and essential features. But in the end, we're actually asking our system to still be able to reconstruct the full data, right? And so in some ways, because this isn't necessarily lossy, we require to hold on to a lot of information that might not actually be relevant for a downstream inference or decoding task, right? Through this sort of reconstruction framework or thought process, if you will, or perspective. So in the machine learning community, the emergence of these tools in what's called self-supervised learning, which is a form of unsupervised, you know, label-free learning, have really started to take or gain a lot of momentum in the field. And these methods are now starting to actually approach the performance of supervised methods in terms of their ability to solve complex downstream tasks like image recognition on, you know, really large data sets like ImageNet. So the sort of origin of this project was just thinking about, okay, we know that these self-supervised methods are now providing really exciting new ways of getting a lens into data in machine learning. And might we be able to leverage or sort of harness the tools in our ability to understand what the brain is doing as I motivated, right? Forming these representations of neural activity, but using these new tools that move away from just this reconstruction-based perspective. Okay, so with that very long-winded intro, now I'll go to this slide, which is, you know, kind of digging into the principles underlying self-supervised learning. And you know, this is a talk, I'm going to talk about our work in this space, but also this is meant to be a tutorial. And so I know that there's a lot of different concepts that I'm kind of going through right now, and feel free to stop me and ask questions to clarify things at any point, just, you know, because I hope that you all will be able to take away some new insights into this rather than it just being, you know, a huge brain dump. Okay, so what is self-supervised learning? There's a lot of different ways in which it's done, but what I'll talk about today is a kind of subset of them that really rely on this idea of information maximization and this principle that essentially, if I have a data point and I can transform it in some way to create a new view or a new visualization of it, if you will. And let's just say I can create these augmentations of the data such that the underlying semantics is preserved, but maybe the pixels and like the, you know, the explicit encoding of that information could be very different across these different views. So as I'm showing here, you know, I have a picture of a dog in my data set, and the idea would be to apply different transformations to that image that will still, you know, create another image of a dog, but it's been zoomed, it's been scaled, it's been rotated. In this case, you might imagine applying some cutout or masking of certain parts of the image, or even additive noise. And essentially in all of these cases, through all of these augmentations, we still have essentially captured the essence of dog, right? And so now what we're going to do is we're going to feed in all of these different augmentations of a sample into our network or into this, deep learning architecture that's essentially trying to maximize the similarity between all of these different transform views in the latent space of this architecture. So essentially we'll create the approach, at a high level is creating augmentation. So these different views of a data point, and then trying to learn a representation that's going to put these different augmentations in a similar part of the latent space, or essentially maximize the similarity between them. And the principles underlying this are related to, as I said before, kind of information maximization, or finding some way where the mutual information between all these augmentations is maximized under this projection. And so you can imagine that if I, do a lot of really crazy things to this picture of a dog, but build a representation that makes all of these very unique pictures of a dog essentially the same in the representation space, then I will have built a very rich feature space that allows me to solve these sorts of image recognition problems in a really robust manner, right? And so really the principles here are using augmentations and this info max sort of loss as a way of building in invariances into your network. Okay, so there are sort of two main classes, or I guess the first sort of instantiation of this idea of information maximization in this kind of instance specific manner, what is sort of, broadly cast through this net of what are called contrastive learning algorithms. And essentially what they're doing is you take, your sample, you can take these different views of it. So here we're taking the cat and kind of zooming in and cropping some new region in space. And as I said before, our goal is to basically pull these different images of the cat together. They're the same example. And so we know their label, right? We don't know that it's a cat, but we know all these views are the same example, right? And then at the same time, the loss function will have another sort of contrastive part to it that's going to also try to push apart other views of other examples that are generated from different samples in your data set, right? So in this case, I have a cat and I have another picture of a dog, but you could imagine having other pictures of cats that are going to serve as what are called negative examples and are going to be pushed apart under this loss function, right? All are the things that are from the same example, and everything else is kind of considered a different instance or a different class in some sense. So, so methods like SimClear are an example of this contrastive learning framework. And these methods, as I said before, have been kind of, very quickly closing the gap on supervised architectures that are trained end to end, right? Whereas in this case, we train the network with this unsupervised loss without labels. We freeze the network, and then we just read out through a linear decoder information about the different classes. So essentially, you can use the network in a fully unsupervised way and then read out its representations to understand whether or not it's learned important aspects of the data that are indicative of this, downstream, in this case, image recognition. And so, as I said before, there's this contrastive learning mechanism where you pull these together and you push these apart. And then more recently, there have been a number of methods introduced that essentially get rid of this explicit contrastive mechanism and really aim to just establish this sort of affinity or pulling of things together. And then you can use different mechanisms to essentially ensure that not everything gets pushed together within the latent space. And so, so this method that sort of gets away or gets rid of these negative examples that was, recently introduced is called BYOL, or Bootstrap Your Own Latent. And I'm showing this picture here just to kind of show where we're at in terms of, these complex image recognition tasks and how BYOL and now supervised methods are essentially at similar levels of performance. Okay. And I'll just kind of go into the details of this. I've already said it at a high level, but just to kind of give a little more of a detailed picture into what this Bootstrap Your Own Latent algorithm is doing. So as I described, we have some sample from our data set. We have some class of augmentations that will apply to it that are stochastically sampled. So we have different, transformations that we can apply. Those will produce two different views of the same sample. And essentially within these frameworks, you pass each of the views through a mirrored. It's kind of complicated, and I don't want to go too much into all of the stuff under the hood, but essentially you have these two networks. They're exactly the same architecture and they're almost the same weights, but they're one of the networks is like a slower version of the weights that are being updated in the online network. So essentially, instead of back propagating all of your gradients through both of these networks, you're only going to update one of the networks, and then you're going to use those weights to then produce like a momentum average version of the previous weights of the target and with a new update. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded. But needless to say, it's sort of drawn here. So we have this online network, we have a target network. I'm denoting the encoder with F theta here. And as I said, this isn't exactly the same network, but it's going to be a kind of slowed down version of this top one. We're going to pass this view through to generate a representation Y. Below, through this other view, we'll get some representation of the other view called Y prime. And then what we're going to do is pass this through a very simple predictor that essentially is going to try to map these different augmentations Y and Y prime into a similar part of the latent space. And that's given by this loss function here, which is just minimizing, in this case, just an L2 distance or a Euclidean distance between the prediction of Y and Y prime. So basically, these two dual networks are sort of working together to give these different augmentations or different views of a sample. And then the predictor is trying to solve this task of bringing them together within the latent space. And this SG is just denoting a stop gradient. So as I was saying, we're going to only update the weights in this network, and then we're going to stop the gradient from actually going back into this second network and updating it. Okay, so we're sort of building on these dual deep networks and this sort of approach for information maximization. And as I said, BYOL is trying to essentially find this minimization of these different views in the latent space using a mechanism that looks like this, or a loss that looks like this. Okay, so with all of that sort of background on, what is self-supervised learning and what are the principles behind these approaches, we can now dig into how we went about applying this idea now to neural activity or neural data sets, which are, the same ideas might be applied to other types of neural data, but in this case, we were interested in applying it to spike sorted data where we have many neurons measured in cortical or hippocampal areas in this case, but we have a population of neurons that we're recording from over time, and we've binned and sorted and then measured the firing rates from all of those neurons within the recorded population. Okay, so we have this data, we have many neurons that are firing over time, and we want to understand what they're doing, right? And so going back to our original motivation of finding this representation. And so the first question that we have when trying to use these self-supervised learning techniques is, what kind of augmentation should we use? Right? Because we saw, as in the image case in computer vision, we have very strong domain expertise that can guide us into building transformations like zooming and rescaling and cropping that will still guarantee or will still preserve the semantic content with high probability, while still providing some, diversity in what the actual instantiation of the sample is. And so we first sort of started with this idea of using nearby points in time as a starting point for building an augmentation for neural data. And this makes sense because, we can assume some sort of temporal consistency in the world and in our representations. And so if we were to look at, a given brain state or firing rate pattern at some point in time, given here by X, so it's a vector of firing rates over D neurons, then one way to define an augmentation would be to look at a nearby point in time and ask whether or not we can, essentially form a representation that will converge to some sort of temporally consistent representation, right? Because if we can put nearby points in time into similar parts of the latent space, then this should induce some sort of smoothness in our representation. And so, so our initial solution was to essentially use nearby time points as an augmentation to sort of seed the learning and this operation for our self-supervised loss function. And it makes sense. There's been a lot of work in predictive coding within neuroscience as well, showing that, the brain wants to build representations where it can predict new things that will happen, right, given previous observations. And so, on one hand, this is a reasonable solution, but on the other hand, it is insufficient to actually build in richness into the data sets that we've tested thus far. And so what we found is, taking it a step further, is actually introducing not only this jitter or sort of looking at nearby points in time, but also removing or masking certain neurons from the brain states over which we want to predict. So this is kind of similar to that cutout or masking example that we showed before in images. Essentially, what we'll do is we're going to, take a brain state, mask some set of neurons, and then create another augmentation of a nearby brain state with using some different subset of neurons. So now, essentially, the network is being asked to figure out some way of finding the things that are sort of consistent across different subsets of neurons within our population that essentially will, build some representation where these things are nearby in the latent space. So it might feel a little bizarre to start. And I think in some sense, there are a lot of interesting questions that we can start to ask using these frameworks about, like, if a type of augmentation works, what does it actually tell us about how the information is being represented within that population of neurons, right? So if we have a distributed code, then it makes sense that if we drop out subsets of neurons, we should still be able to decode similar pieces of information, even from a subset of that population. And we know that when we go into the brain and we record a different subset of neurons each time, we can still decode this information often. And so it makes sense that having some amount of permutation invariance that might be induced through this dropout operation could actually be an important type of implicit bias or regularization that could be just useful for neural networks applied to neural data in general.
Eva, can
Yeah.
we, there are a few questions in Slack. I wonder if
Oh, yeah, please.
while you're talking, or do you prefer we?
Yeah, go ahead. That would be great.
So I think Priya, you had a few questions come up for you. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, hi, thanks. This is really interesting. I'm really excited. But yeah, I think I'm kind of circling around this issue of how do you know that the augmentations are, I would put this in quotes, realistic, you know? Like thinking about the example of a dog, okay, your visual perceptor or your, you know, vision machine, whatever, you could see a dog from the left or from the right or upside down. But you could also see a dog, you know, at an unusual angle or head on instead of just kind of flat like that. And kind of related, it's like, okay, so you're doing the augmentations by dropping out neurons, but how many or which neurons can you drop out, and how do you know that it's still actually just a perturbation or an augmentation of this quote same state, and that you're not like training on a different state now? Does that make sense?
Those are great. Oh, was that it? Sorry, I
Yeah,
didn't mean to
yeah.
cut you. Okay. Those are great questions, and it's actually hard to like fit all of this into the motivation, right? Because it's like there's so many things to really unpack here. So to answer your second question about how do we know that we haven't, you know, broken the semantics or removed this information, we don't fully know, but we can read out information that has to do with the behavior that we know is linked to these neural recordings and ask whether or not we can still decode these pieces of information, right? So I'll get into some examples, two in particular, one where we're looking at macaques, so non-human primates that are carrying out a reaching task, where we know the underlying behavior that neurons in the motor cortex are representing, right? And so if we can form a representation and then from that read out these different pieces of information about the target location and decoding of different reaches, then at least we know that we have a representation that has some meaningful link to the behavior that we know is related, but we don't necessarily know that we haven't lost other pieces of information that these circuits might care about. With that being said, you know, when we compare this to other unsupervised representation learning systems, like they also suffer from similar issues of losing information, but they do it through just like minimizing an L2 loss. And so you're not sure what you're losing there either, but it's usually linked more to things that have high variance, right? And so in some ways we're using augmentations as a way of like building in these invariances to get a picture into what the brain is doing. But yes, there's not necessarily, you know, we can use this as a lens into that, and then use these different behavioral readouts as a way to kind of see what we've preserved and what we might have broken in the data, I guess, if you will. So hopefully that kind of gives you some answers to your question, then I'll get further in. And then the other thing that you asked was, how do you know if it's realistic? And so one thing that I'll say here is that while it's true that, yeah, there's all these different ways that you could imagine seeing a dog, and many of them you're never going to create just through a transformation of that dog, right? But then there's also a lot of things that people do in these cases to like build in other invariances that actually are generating things that you would never expect to actually see in nature. So like a picture of a cutout dog is not really from the actual distribution of the data, but because it still has the dog in it, and it's telling the network now to look over, like to build a representation that doesn't take in the whole image, but also has to build its inference from smaller parts of the image, right? In that sense, it's not realistic, but it's still helpful. And I think maybe for similar reasons, we find that dropping out of neurons through this kind of local property of coding, if you will, could also be a reason why we get some nice properties from our system, or from our from what we're doing here. And I see another hand up as well. Yeah.
Yes, hi, this is really interesting and exciting. And I probably come from quite of a opposite or a contrary perspective, as seeing these types of controlling neurons can leading to a highly complex states of modeling. So there are a lot of modeling and treating the same set of data set. So what's your thoughts on, now we fix the model and then fit as many data as possible, and this can be a lot of docs from lots of perspectives, as many as possible, and see how that fixed model behave towards that big data set. So it might be very different from the modeling you are implementing now, but what's your thoughts about that kind of perspective?
So I think that I understand your question. And I think actually what we end up doing next is maybe kind of moving in the direction that you're talking about, but I might need to clarify your question. So, or maybe, okay, so here, I'll tell you what we do next, and then maybe you can tell me if that answers to some extent some of the questions that you had, right?
Sure.
So one of the things, right, is like, okay, so I have this picture, and if I know good augmentations, then I can basically, you know, figure out how to transform them all. But I think what you're saying is I actually have a lot of images of dogs, right? I don't just have this image of a dog. And so if there would be some way of actually knowing where the other dogs were, I don't know if this is your question, but this is where I was getting to.
Yes, actually, this is kind of mimic the 6 pictures that you have, that the data are not perfect, right? There are incomplete space there. So I mean, imagine like data are so dirty. So they are labeled as dogs.
I see. Yeah, that's a different point.
Yes.
But it's interesting because you can imagine building an invariance through these systems because you have a lot of varied perspectives that you want to be able to capture at test time, right? Which would be helpful here. But then at the same time, you can also imagine this self-supervised learning or augmentation also being helpful for avoiding nuisance variables or other noise in your data that you don't want to recapitulate in your representation. And so I think what you're saying is you could have noisy data, and because the noise isn't the same across all the different views or augmentations, you could also use this as a way of helping with that as well, I think.
And see that particular model, how that behave towards that kind of nuisance. But I think this is very interesting. We should explore both from a modeling perspective and from a data perspective.
Yeah, no, it's still kind of unclear exactly where because as I was saying, there's some cases where really harsh and non-domain realistic augmentations are best, and other cases where, you know, having realistic generation of perspectives is helpful. So yeah, likely those really bizarre augmentations are probably helpful in breaking noise and other corruption in the data, more so than the kind of generative modeling perspective. But that sort of gets us to the motivation for this new representation learning approach that we developed, which is kind of related to both of the questions that we just discussed, which is that, you know, when I have a large data set that is actually quite rich and diverse, why not try to find other examples in my data set that I can use as an augmentation, right? And so this idea that I talked about before, it's like, okay, I have a picture of a dog, and if I know how to make another picture of a, the same dog still look different, then I can use this approach. But what if I could just find other pictures of dogs and then try to build a model that could learn to, predict across all these different instantiation of different dogs? And so we developed this idea, which we call Mind Your Own View, or meow, which essentially tries to find augmentations that are just different samples within the same data set. And so essentially finding these links across different examples as a way of forming these predictive relationships. And so if we think about this in the context of brain activity, if we were looking very locally before over these, nearby points in time to form our augmentations, we're now asking whether or not it's possible to go outside of that, kind of local point or view and, find other brain states that might be similar to what we're experiencing, but might not be close to us in time. And some ideas of, or motivations behind this is like, we can imagine what a similar looking dog would look like, right? Or we can have memories of what this same dog, or maybe a dog from our childhood that might have had the same color fur or something, right? So the brain is able to generate or make links between different points in time that have similar kind of representations of the state. And by forming those kind of, more long range predictions, we might be able to have a more rich representation space that isn't so myopic or sort of local, right? So that was the sort of idea behind this approach for SSL, is to mine from within the data set to find augmentations, and then use those as a way to enhance self-supervised learning. And so this is the sort of picture of this approach, which we call Mind Your Own View, which builds on BYOL, the previous algorithm that I sort of showed. And so it does it by, essentially, as I showed before, we have these two different dual networks. Oh, someone's crying or with joy. Maybe they liked meow as an acronym. And there's cats here, so right. So as we saw before, we have these dual networks. We would normally, take an image, produce these two different views of it, pass it through the online and the target network. And then before, we were trying to just build this predictive relationship between representations of augmentations. And what we do now is go a step further through this sort of secondary, and it's almost like a hierarchical, cascaded architecture, right? Where you have these more local things that you're trying to predict in the first stage, and then you try to use that representation and go across these more non-local or distant parts within the representation space and forming predictions across different samples in this case. And so we I have the loss function here. It's just combining this sort of BYOL loss on augmentations plus this other mining term. And then this is just showing this example of basically to find those candidates, or sorry, to find the examples that will link through this mining procedure. In the end, what we do is we basically put candidate views or samples through the second encoder, and then we select them using nearest neighbors or something that finds k nearest neighbors and then picks one of them stochastically. So essentially what you're doing is you are forming these representations through these dropped out and nearby points in times that gives you like this good local representation of the environment and the world. And then from that, you can start linking these non-local points that are close to you in the representation space using something like nearest neighbors and feeding that into the system. And so just showing here this idea of like, oh, now I have all these different candidates and I would choose another one that's sort of close to my picture of a cat, but it's not the same one. Okay, so now, oh wow, this I've already spent quite a while. So, and we're done at 4:30. Oh no, we started a little late. So
yeah,
I guess
minutes after that.
Okay, so now this we can get into the results using Meow and these other self-supervised learning approaches that I discussed before on two different main examples. The first one being this movement decoding example from non-human primate, and here we're recording from primary motor cortex. So M1. What I'm showing here are the results now for 4 different data sets. So what we do is we basically, you have to figure out, oh, how am I going to, I think another question earlier was, oh, how do you actually augment the data, right? How do you figure out which neurons to drop out? So in this case, we have sort of tuned the hyperparameters, so the architecture and the dropout probabilities and augmentations on one data set, and hold all of that fixed, and then use that same sort of architecture and everything for these other 3 data sets. So in this case, we can actually generalize now with retraining those architectures on different individuals without having to re-optimize the augmentations and dropout and so on and so forth. So we're just showing the ability to form these representations across these different data sets. Then we freeze the network, and then we're going to just train a linear classifier to be able to decode one of 8 different reach directions that the animal is making a reach towards. And then from that, we're reporting the accuracy of that 8 choice decoding, 8 choice target output. Sorry. So what I'm showing here are the results with an autoencoder that has this same sort of, decoding task applied to its representation space, as well as SimClear, the contrastive learning method, BYOL, and Meow. And in all these cases, we're comparing with a supervised decoder that's trained end-to-end on the same task. So one thing that's really interesting and a cool takeaway from this is that in many of the data sets that we tested, we can actually outperform a supervised decoder on held out test data in terms of this neural decoding task. So what that means is that, if you want to train a deep learning architecture on a neural decoding task, right, and you want to train it end to end, you might have some overfitting or some loss in terms of your generalization when you try to test it on some new data set that you haven't trained on, right? And what we're showing here is that through this dropout and so what I'm showing here is even for BYOL, which doesn't use this additional sort of long range prediction as a way of infusing information into the representations, in both BYOL and Meow, we're actually outperforming a supervised decoder. So what we're showing is that dropout is inducing some really nice implicit biases into these neural networks that allow us to generalize better on downstream decoding tasks than just training the neural network alone. So that's a really cool result, I think, in itself. And then moreover, we're showing, in some cases, really large improvements over, things like autoencoders or BYOL or some of these other representation learning systems. And we have added to these results now with even fancier autoencoders. And so this shows us that both the temporal shift and dropout augmentations provide this diversity and preservation of task semantics in this case. We can go further and kind of dig into how different classes of augmentations, impact the final decoding performance and really dissect this carefully. And what I'm showing here are just visualizations of the latent space from some of these different methods, both for 2 different individuals. And what we find in general is if we look at the global and local structure that we get with Meow, we can kind of preserve the task semantics and geometry more effectively, which in this case is center outreaching. So we're actually preserving the ordering of the targets and the circular structure. This is now looking just in 3D at visualizations of these embeddings The points are, being colored by the target direction. So we can see this really nice kind of global geometric structure and pulling all these different classes out, and then also preserving the sort of velocity distribution of the task as well. Okay. I spent a very long time kind of going to all of the, nitty gritty here. Hopefully you learned some new things about representation learning. I know we're running out of time, so I'm going to try to just kind of quickly go through this. The second example is now applying the same tools, but to rodent. And in this case, I'll dig further into the mouse CA1, so hippocampus results, but these results are just showing that, with the same classes of augmentations, we can actually still do very good at decoding of different behavioral variables from the representations learned with this. But now in this case, we have really coarse behavioral labels. So, before we had this really constrained task where the behavior was really embedded within those labels, but now we just have labels about whether or not the animal was awake or whether or not they were in REM or non-REM sleep. And these are now recordings over 12-hour-long stretches in free behaving conditions where the animal is just sort of moving around the cage and doing what they will, right? And so the labels that we're giving to kind of optimize at least the augmentations in this case are really far from what the full richness of the data is. And what we find is that when we actually visualize the representations learned, and now we're color coding them by the different labels of REM, non-REM, and wake, even just with the behavioral readouts that we have, which we have very good decoding accuracy on, we're finding that there's a lot of really interesting clustered and other structures that are present within these representations found by Meow that we can't get with just analyzing the firing rates alone using different dimensionality reduction techniques. So there's something that's really coming out of these methods that we can't get with a reconstruction type approach, but we're digging further into this to really do this, test this out rigorously. But I'll quickly show you in the last time remaining some new tools that we have developed, which I'm really excited about, which allow us to, in TensorBoard, which maybe you're kind of playing around with a little bit over in the course. So TensorBoard, gives us a way of basically taking a neural network and then looking at the latent space or the representations within the network kind of in an easy way. And we basically have built a TensorBoard extension that allows us to kind of click on points in the latent space, so shown here, and then zoom into all of these nearest neighbors in the representation space and look at the video and behavioral readouts of what was actually going on within the cage over those points in times that the network is saying we're sort of close in terms of the representation. And so this stuff is hot off the press, like we just finished this last week. So we're starting to just now really dissect all of this. But what I'm showing here is a cluster that's been pulled out that seems to correspond very heavily to water bottle drinking. So here I'm just showing a positional heat map over all of the nearest neighbors and where the animal was. We can see like a tracing of the cage, its ball, and its water bottle spout. And in many of these cases, I don't know if we can see, if you can sort of see in the video, in most of these cases, we're finding that the animal indeed is drinking from the water bottle, which is really cool because this is kind of a rare event that we were trying to pull out through like behavioral decoding before. And so it was really exciting to see that the neural data revealed to us this unique aspect of the behavior. We can go further into other clusters. This one we call getting comfy, but basically they have a nest at the center, and in all of these frames, it's sort of moving its bedding material. And we see again that, in the positional heat map, we have a pretty high correspondence. This is cool because they have two, they have like a box and a ball down here in the right corner. And so this is a cluster of behavior that has to do with this sort of play dynamic. And we can kind of as I said, these are still really new, but we're starting to consistently find that Meow is kind of zooming in on these behaviorally relevant aspects of the data, and we have a way of pulling out video and kind of going between the two in this easy way. By the way, if anyone wants to use this tool, we're happy to share. Just, I mean, you know, if you have video and you have latent spaces and you want to find a way to visualize them, please feel free to reach out. This was nest building. So this is kind of cool because it actually involves like a lot of different places in space, but they're all kind of related to pulling in the nest material and so on and so forth. And we're starting to also look into some of the sleep transitions or sleep clusters as well, where we don't have behavioral readouts currently, but we can see whether or not the animal's transitioning between different sleep stages. Okay, great. So I know that we're basically at time, and I want to give time for more questions. So I'll just summarize. I talked about and introduced a new approach for self-supervised learning that allows us to mine our data set to find augmentations that we can use for prediction. We talked about the application of it to neural population activity and representation learning, and showing, you know, we can beat these supervised decoders in some cases. And then finally, I'll just say that we have new work coming out. I have a link at the bottom that sort of combines these self-supervised learning techniques with generative models, which I was dissing on at the beginning, but like we wanted to have the best of both, right? And what we're trying to do there is to be able to use these ideas to disentangle neural representations and find ways to figure out the how and the what in movement. So both figuring out where you want to go and also how you get there through the residual components that you can get through the generative model. So kind of having this ability to form good representations and still generate neural activity through combining. And don't have time to go into that, but we have stuff up on the website now if you're interested in this other tool called Swap VAE, which takes this idea further for even more interpretable representations. Okay, and I'll end there. Thank you so much for your attention, and happy to take more questions.
Thanks,
Thank
Eva.
you.
Yeah, we can have a few more minutes for questions from folks. Yeah, how? Feel free to.
So just to be clear, in the mouse video, the position in the cage was just for the viewing convenience, and the model was trained just on the neural data, right?
Right. Yeah. So this was just a way for us to kind of zoom in to the neural representations and see if they're correlated with behavior. We don't use that when training the model, but we're really excited to see if we can link it back to those finer scale behaviors in the future.
Okay, and what's the area that's being recorded from?
So this is all in hippocampus.
Okay, wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, so there's a lot of cool stuff happening there in hippocampus.
Thank you.
Yeah, this is like just showing a zoomed out view of it after PCA as well. So here we can see more of the clustering kind of without more of this fractionated representation that we're showing in this case, where it's like even more clustery.
I guess a question that arises from that, and I'm sort of paraphrasing here, questions that are arising in Slack is, we know there's some position coding in hippocampus, right? So in a sense, it's not surprising that this is surprising, right? Where it's not positionally focused, but where it's picking up, where it's learning kind of like positionally focused patterns. That's something you might expect just from position coding. So I wonder how you think about that.
Yeah,
But-
so this is
one-
like where the cool science is now, right? In terms of understanding this. And so as I understand it, a lot of times in these more free behavior conditions, and I would love to talk to folks here if you have insights into this. In these free behavior conditions, often like place cells aren't very like the cells aren't very strongly encoding of place as they are in more kind of controlled, mazes and tasks where the animal is kind of put into a more challenging environment that isn't necessarily reflective of its natural behavior. And so as I understand it, in many cases, you don't see as strong of a place encoding effect within these natural behavior conditions. So that's one thing. And on the other hand, it's like, okay, well, when we are dealing with naturalistic behavior, it makes sense that there could be a more complex encoding that goes beyond just, encoding of place and is actually kind of more behaviorally relevant, or it's sort of relevant to the motivation or intention or, engagement of the animal when it's in that place, which is, I guess, what we would potentially think about when looking at the results, say here, right? And then at the same time, there's a lot of behavioral clusters that are basically in the same place, but are different behaviors. And those are also being kind of encoded in different parts of the representation space, but that's less clear to me. Right now, we'd have to dissect that a little bit further to see if that's interesting.
I think maybe a different way to sort of look at it is to say, sure, in the history of this field, when people have recorded in hippocampus, they've been able to extract this position coding because that's so explicit, but it's entirely possible that hippocampus is also coding for much more abstract properties of behavior, or much more complicated properties of behavior that could only be pulled out in this way from naturalistic behavior also. So I think
that's the exciting promise here, right? Is kind of through combining these advanced analytical tools with kind of unique measurement technologies or recording tools, we're seeing something, new, and it's exciting, right? Data science.